Ready? Great. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us here for the first issue briefing of the annual meeting of the Global Future Councils here in Dubai in 2018. What more important subject to start the debate around than the future of jobs? Now, I'm not quite sure whether it was in 2014 when Elon Musk mentioned that AI bore the greatest existential threat to humankind. Maybe it was in 2016 when we produced at the forum our first research on the numbers of the millions of jobs we expected to be displaced by automation and roboticization. Or maybe it was the ensuing debate, but we've had a more mature and sensible conversation since then, and more studies have come out about the opportunities as well as the risks posed by technology. Incredibly live debate, and one that we could spend much longer than 30 minutes talking about. But I'm very glad to have had carved 30 minutes of time out of your diaries and my speakers here to hopefully get to the crux of this and where we're at in 2018 with regards to the radical revolution that we're seeing and starting to see take place in workplaces and workforces around the world. So, my name is Oliver Cann. I work in the media team at the World Economic Forum. You will not be hearing a lot from me, hopefully. I'll be displaced by my three panelists and yourselves. I'm joined by Andrew McAfee, co-director, co-founder of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, principal research scientist at MIT in the USA, of course, the co-author last year of the second machine platform crowd, also 2014's teen seminal work, The Second Machine Age with Eric Brynjolfsson. Mariana Mazzucato, Professor of Economics, Innovation and Public Value at the University College of London in the UK, a very well-known attempted resident of the United Kingdom from your recent Twitter posts. I'm sure we may come into that, I hope not. Author this year's book, Value of Everything, which has been talked about a lot, and in 2014, The Entrepreneurial State. Of course, Saadia Zahidi, member of our managing board and head of our Centre of the New Economy and Society, one of the more interesting, if not the most interesting areas of intellectual research that we're conducting at the forum. We've produced two papers in the past 9 months, Reskill Revolution, which attempts to map out the opportunities for those whose jobs are maybe in line for displacement, and a study in September of this year, Future of Jobs 2018, which offers new insights from the world's largest companies on where and how they expect to hire and displace workers. So my premise to start the conversations, and I'd like as many questions as possible, is simply to gauge the current situation in terms of the workplace revolution. We see at the moment, and maybe Saadia, this is something for you to start us off with, we're seeing a situation whereby we now have a much clearer idea of the millions of jobs that will be displaced over the coming years, but more importantly, we're starting to see a much more clear idea on the kinds of jobs that are needed and that could replace them, and maybe there's a positive aspect there. Perhaps you could enlighten us.
Sure. The first thing I would start off with is none of this is predetermined. I think we can make all the predictions in the world, but it's really going to depend on the choices and the decisions we take today. That said, we did conduct a survey of some of the largest companies in the world and their heads of HR, heads of strategy, and in some cases their CEOs. These are really the people at the front lines of driving this change. They're the ones who are taking these decisions, who are making these investments, and in some cases making these displacements. And we asked them what they thought the future of jobs looked like in a near term, in a very predictable future in the next 4 years. And what we found was that they are expecting a net gain overall. So in the 20 economies that we were looking at, a loss of about 75 million jobs and a gain of about 133. So 50 million plus gain in terms of jobs. But they all pointed out that this augmentation strategy that they were expecting was highly dependent on finding better ways to reskill and upskill workers, and yet they didn't think that there were very clear solutions to that. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is we've been doing some research around, well, where will those future jobs come from? And that, of course, I mean, my co-panelists will say a lot more about this as well, but there is an expected gain when it comes to the care sector, there's an expected gain when it comes to the education sector, there are expected gains when it comes to green jobs or green technologies, and there are expected gains in high-skilled roles across multiple sectors. And maybe the final point I'll just make is, yes, there will be a need for a lot more skills that relate to technology, But what we got from a lot of the heads of HR of at least these largest firms in the world was that there's a need for much more human skills. So analytical skills, critical thinking, collaboration with others, active listening. Those are the kinds of skills that are rising up to the surface. And so by no means is the future of jobs only related to technology. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. And Andrew, it's a transition that needs to be managed, of course. The jobs that are going to be lost are not the same as the jobs created. From your experience, how is this going to be achieved?
Via flexibility in the face of great change. During a time of great change, the right response is not rigidity, is not confidence that you know what's going to happen, and is not reliance on the status quo. The right response is to let the innovators and the entrepreneurs do what they do, which is create jobs. Of course, they destroy jobs with technology. The balance of more than 200 years of the industrial era is that they create more jobs than they destroy. I'm with Saadia. I don't see any evidence that that is about to change in the short term. So rule number one is let the innovators and entrepreneurs do what they do. They are the job creation engine. And even in countries with a very, very high percentage of employment by the government, France is one of the highest among wealthy countries, that's only 25% of jobs. So even in the biggest state economies, the huge majority of jobs come from the private sector. So that brings up a follow-up question: what's the role of government to ensure healthy job creation and creation of good jobs? We've got a pretty good playbook for that. We're just not following it very well in all cases. We need a robust educational system to deliver the skills that people need, and my research lines up very nicely with Saadia is about what those skills are. We need excellent infrastructure, and in too much of the world, infrastructure is crumbling. And we need governments to support basic research, because left to its own, the market tends to underinvest in those kinds of things. So the basic playbook is clear. I don't see any need to tear that playbook up and try to write a radically new one for this era that we're heading into. I think we need to follow the playbook and rely on the engines of job creation that we've had in the past, and maintain an attitude of flexibility and proper support.
Just a follow-up question. For example, driving is a professional driver is one of the biggest job descriptions of many states in America. Do we have the playbook ready at scale for such a transition? We're just at the beginning of this, after all.
Yeah, the driving question is a great question. And yes, we have the playbook, and no, we don't. And what I mean by that is there are something like 3 million people in the United States that make their living via driving. And let's say that all of them are going to be automated away. This is not true. This is not what's going to happen in any reasonable time frame. But assume that all of them are automated away. That sounds like a big number. There are more than 1.5 million layoffs every month in the United States economy. We have a huge economy. We have a dynamic economy. So could we absorb an additional 3 million job losses? Yeah, absolutely, without breaking a sweat, we could. The problem is that the kinds of people who are doing those jobs right now are the ones where we know they're having the most trouble re-entering the labor force after automation comes for them. So in my country, there are specific demographic pockets and geographic pockets that are having real trouble with this adjustment. This presents a problem. We don't know exactly what the right playbook is to get those people and communities back into the workforce. I think that's a really important area for research and for thinking about smart interventions. But the problem is not that we might have 3 million jobs that are automated away. That is actually not a problem.
Of course, and of course that's interesting. We'll come back to the communities, the black spots, of course. Globalization 4.0 is the theme of the annual meeting in Davos in January, and that will be about how do we make globalization better? How do we avoid the mistakes of the past? How do we make sure that the benefits are felt by everybody and no communities or job types get left behind? But Mariana, let's go back to you. Your recent book expands it in very elegant detail your belief that some corporate success is not always down to brilliance in the strategy of the boardroom, but also relies on efforts by governments as well, which ties into your previous book, The Entrepreneurial State. So from who is best placed and how are we best going to, again, manage the workplace revolution according to your thinking?
Can I just step back one step, which is the context that we're in, and I think sometimes we kind of lose the plot when we don't look at history. So the first serious economist was David Ricardo, I think. And already in 1821, in his Principles of Political Economy, he was talking about these questions. He actually had a chapter called On Machinery. It was called Chapter 31. And he said, we're in trouble. All this mechanization, the robots of the time, are taking jobs, they're reducing wages. Now, what we then saw in the next 200 years from when he wrote that was that we actually had creative destruction, not just in terms of technology, but also jobs. So even though jobs might actually be disappearing in one part of the economy, they were in fact reappearing in another part. But that wasn't due to some sort of magic. That was due to something called reinvestment. So when profits generated from, let me be simplistic here, machine A, are then reinvested in another part of the economy, we get this creative destruction. When they start getting hoarded, when they start getting financialized, which I think is the state of modern capitalism, where basically since the 1980s we have this corporate governance structure, which is maximization of shareholder value, that reinvestment cycle starts to stop. And so when you have $2 trillion being hoarded in the US, equivalent amount in Europe, when you have $3 trillion in the last 10 years being used just to buy back shares to boost stock prices and stock options, and surprise, surprise, executive pay, that hurts jobs, that hurts skills, because skills don't only come from government training programs, as important as they are. They have historically also come out of an endogenous result of investment, business investment. Businesses also investing in R&D, but also in human capital formation. And this is the big elephant in the room. And if we don't talk about corporate governance at the same time that we're talking about jobs and innovation, we're missing the trick. In terms of governments, I mean, of course governments are there to fix market failures and invest in all sorts of different areas where the private sector doesn't invest in. However, again, that doesn't actually help us understand where some of the biggest technological changes came from, where government also played an investor first resort role, actually investing in the high-risk, early-stage areas, which then got us all the cool things that are in your smartphones, you know, internet, GPS, Siri, touchscreen display, that did not occur from the entrepreneurs, that came from certain types of government investment. It's not just government money, but serious agencies that, you know, the DARPA-type agencies, but around the world, increasingly, by the way, in China, if we look at the Green Revolution. And that, again, do we have a narrative? Do we have a discussion around the world of how government today should be leading in the Green Revolution as it did in the IT revolution, so businesses can actually surf that wave as they did surf that wave previously? And that also then requires government thinking of its role as co-creating, co-shaping, also the benefits, right? So this narrative that it's just the entrepreneurs creating jobs and technology has then justified a skewed distribution of the income generated. And I could go on, but I'm talking too much.
Well, I was enjoying it, but
oh, I'm happy to go on.
Let's see. Let's give somebody else a chance.
Can I respond to that? Because I want to agree vociferously and then disagree as well. I completely agree that in the family tree of almost any profound innovation, you're going to find a government program. And DARPA and others in the States have been instrumental. One of my sources of dismay back home is that we are turning away from fundamental research and innovation exactly at a time when we're seeing technological progress accelerate. I think that the UAE has announced a plan for AI. China has announced a really concerted national effort to be good at artificial intelligence. And the response back home in the United States has been a lot more fragmented, a lot smaller, a lot more chaotic. Shame on us for that. However, my career is long enough. I have been hearing about chronic corporate short-termism for my entire career. Financialization is a bit of a new term. It's kind of a twist on the narrative, but I've been hearing this narrative that we're too focused on shareholder value and too short-term for as long as I've been studying the business world. I really have trouble identifying the massive harms that come from that. For example, we do not have a job creation problem in the United States. We've created jobs without fail for more than 110 months in a row. If the short-termism were harming jobs, I think we probably would have seen a different pattern. My colleague Bob Gordon has a great way to say it. We don't have a job quantity problem. We have a job quality problem. I don't have as direct a link as you do, I think, between financialization and the creation of gig economy jobs as opposed to good old-fashioned stable American middle-class jobs.
So this is going to become a tennis match here, so you have to keep going like this. The profit share of GDP worldwide is currently at record levels, so the profit-labor relationship. That is a result of financialization. So the appropriations of wealth that is actually, in my view, created collectively, different types of businesses, different types of public organizations, and increasingly in the areas of energy and health, different types of third sector organizations. The rewards to that should also be shared collectively, not through some sort of socialist agenda, but a capitalist agenda which actually admits where that wealth came from. So I do think that's a problem. And it shouldn't just be seen in terms of redistribution policies, kind of charity, you know, UBI, a handout to people, but actually a citizen's share. You know, it is the citizens that have invested through their taxes in some of the lead technologies that I mentioned, but also, by the way, in companies like Tesla. Where did Tesla get its early stage high risk funding? From the US taxpayer, $465 million in a guaranteed loan. Same amount of money, just a bit more went to Solyndra. That failed. So if governments, big if we want governments to continue acting as a sort of public venture capital in these high risk and long-term areas that frankly the VC industry has not been willing to fund, they're very exit driven, they want their exit in 3 to 5 years through an IPO or a buyout, right? So they themselves are a bit short-termist, it's not just the companies, then we should actually really be rethinking the distribution of risks and rewards. And by the way, governments haven't just funded science. That has been critical. That's a classic public good problem. They have also funded applied areas. They have also provided, as I just mentioned, that early stage high risk capital. In Israel, for example, the startup nation, this occurred through Yozma, a public venture capital fund. Fracking itself came out of the DOE. Just breaking, getting rid of the ideology and really saying, what would it look like if we have a serious conversation worldwide on how to have an interesting, dynamic, symbiotic, mutualistic, not parasitic predator-prey, public-private partnership in solving key challenges we have. Look at the SDGs. They present us the challenge, but do the moonshots within those. And not just talk about the need for government in terms of training programs and basic science, but being a serious co-creator of this wealth and also citizens getting a serious share of what's produced.
So I think as we go into half-time, we're seeing a relatively decent track record, the private sector, the innovators, of creating a playbook that can solve some of these problems. I'm still concerned about whether we're geared up for the scale that we're about to see, and some of Saadia's research suggests that this displacement is going to accelerate. And do we have that sensible and serious conversation ready to be taken to meet the vast needs of the future? A great time for us to invite you all to ask more questions. We only have a few minutes, 15 minutes left, so please show your hand if you'd like to ask anything. Well, I can't believe that. Gentleman in the front row.
Hi, thanks for this. Do I need to say who I am?
Yes, please, Mustafa.
Okay. Thank you. Mustafa Al-Rawi from The National. Thanks. It's a great chat, and it's wonderful to hear somebody talking for the little guy out there. And I think sometimes it's difficult to hear the voice of the disenfranchised, of those who might have not benefited necessarily from the good gains of globalization. But how do you get both sides talking, I guess, when it comes to jobs? How do you, in the moment, things are so fractured and the political landscape is so polarized that we can sit here and talk in a measured way, but how do you get both sides to actually discuss it to ensure that there is proper redistribution in Globalization 4.0?
So I don't like the word redistribution. I think we should talk about sort of pre-distribution, right? And that's what I mean by actually recognizing explicitly these different actors, of course business, but not only, that are required. And I think a concrete way, almost an experiment, a lab kind of experiment would be, just imagine if in cities we changed the current relationship. So there's all this data being generated, right? Currently that data is housed in companies that then we worry about it afterwards. A, how to tax it, B, the whole privacy, GDPR set of issues. What would it look like if that data, which is, by the way, retrieved through this publicly funded technology, internet, GPS, et cetera, and it's the data of the citizens, literally the public, so the people, what would it look like if it was actually housed in some sort of repository that was run not by a boring bureaucrat sort of top down, but some sort of organization? Think of, we have the UN, we have, CERN, a public lab that's innovative. So we have some sort of governance structure of the data, which then companies have to either pay into and or accept certain types of conditions, which would be dynamic conditions. Again, we know how to do interesting governance problems dynamically. We also know how they fail when they're done in a static way. So just assume it can be done dynamically. That would be very different. It'd be a different type of relationship. And it's not as if it would be imposed. This is just a recognition that, again, the tech is a collective enterprise. The data is collective. Why have we allowed the data to be housed in companies, and then we're always trying to catch up to that process? That would change the way the little guy potentially benefits.
I'm a bit confused by that. You say it's not imposed, but in the scheme that you're proposing, would Facebook, for example, have to share its data more broadly?
But look at it the other way. Who decided that Facebook has all the data? How is that not imposed?
I didn't hear
that is a lack of regulation.
I didn't hear an answer to my question.
No, because the nature of the question is dismissing the key thing that I've been saying, which is this data has actually been generated collectively. Why have we allowed it to be housed in a company?
But you would impose.
So why is that
you would,
top-down?
You would impose a change, or would you? Not? I'm just trying to get
Change
clear.
has always been a good thing. Hey, we all, we have weekends. That was a change that people fought for. We have an 8-hour workday. People fought for that. So the question of change and people fighting for change, hopefully, is seen as something progressive, and not regressive and not top-down. So I totally get what you're saying, Andy, because I do believe innovation only occurs when you have feedback processes, when it's nonlinear, when it's not top-down. I actually think the situation we've gotten into, which is the way we've allowed platform capitalism to develop, that's happened through, in some ways, a top-down process. In other words, the skewed distribution of income has been generated from a problematic way to have framed the problem.
Thank you for that clarity. You mentioned the little guys around the world, and the little guys have been by far the biggest beneficiaries of global capitalism over the past generation or two. If you look at all the people in the world and you line them up from lowest income to highest income, over the past 30 years, there has been almost uniform large increase in their incomes. It took about 600 years, from 1200 to 1800, for the average person's income around the world to increase by 50%. The average person's income around the world has increased by more than 50% since 1988. This is an unalloyed triumph of the system that we've created. Now, there are exceptions to that rule, and the biggest exception corresponds to the lower middle class and the middle class in rich countries around the world. That's an important demographic group. I come from the American middle class. It's near and dear to me. I think it's also an important demographic group because the middle class in the rich world helps select the leaders of the rich world, and leaders in the rich world have a huge influence on how things unfold. But we should be really clear on what's happened to the little guy over the past generation or two. Faster progress, larger escapes from poverty, bigger increases in health than we have seen before in human history.
So, if I may be so bold, Andrew, I think one of the issues that we grapple with when we look at the theme of our annual meeting and the thinking that goes in is that there have been, nonetheless, income inequalities allowed to grow and to become exacerbated. And so perhaps a lot of the political issues we see around the world and various regions around the world is not because of the growth of income, 50% plus over 1980s is amazing, but it's disproportionate to the growth at the top end. And I suppose one of the questions is, do we need to see a realignment between the amount of labour as part of national income to create a stable society? Because this isn't about economics, it's about stability it's about ways of life and peace and harmony in the world.
Can I lateral that one to Zahidi? You've been quiet in this discussion for a while. The decline in labor share is real, and it's happening in almost all the economies around the world. So it's tough for me to ascribe that to financialization. German industries and the German government have a very different structure for how you represent workers on companies than America does. They're still going through basically the same change of a shift toward winner-take-all dynamics and a decline in labor share. It is very broad-based around the world. To me, that implies there are very deep structural forces at work, and the two that I can identify are tech progress and global capitalism. Great. What do we do in response to that? The social safety net, I believe, does need to get rethought. And I do think that our tax burden falls disproportionately on labor. That's a pretty straight disincentive to that. And we know that there are ways to help out working people via taxes and transfers that don't have that nasty flavor of redistribution and bad incentives. One of my favorites, there's a small negative income tax in the United States called the Earned Income Tax Credit. And while rule number one of social policy is that there are no magic bullets, rule number two is that the EITC is about as close as we found to a magic bullet. It helps people's incomes, and it encourages them, provides them incentives to work and get all the benefits of work from that. So again, my frustration is we kind of know what a good playbook looks like. We're just not putting it in place, certainly in my country and in a lot of other countries around the world, in the face of these huge, very, very broad structural changes, which to me are not about rapacious changes in the system, they're about deeper tectonic forces.
Saadia. So Mustafa's question about people working together, that sounds suspiciously like multi-stakeholder collaboration. You've been doing that quite a lot recently. You've been following up on your research to actually try to map out with business leaders and with government leaders some of the pathways forward. can you tell us about that and how we can get to this magic number of, of avoiding the mass job displacement that we all fear?
Can I also slightly step back and take on one other part of the question? I mean, I don't think it's as polarized as what we're making it out to be. It's just that who the winners and the losers are has changed a lot and has changed very rapidly over the last 10 years. So take the platform work example. So yes, in many parts of the Western world, that is seen to be precarious work because there was a different type of structure of jobs or aspired structure of jobs beforehand. At the same time, in a lot of the, including in this region where I come from, Pakistan, a lot of those, the gig platforms are actually providing the most secure form of income that a lot of young people who have no other job opportunities are able to now have. So there are some benefits as well to this aspect, and I think we need to look at what the context is, and in some places, those new forms of technology and globalization are providing new opportunities, in other cases not so much. To the question that you actually asked, one of the things we've been trying to do is understand, where is, in the absence of some of the pre-distributive structures that don't yet exist and which long-term work is being hopefully done on, where is it that we can make a dent? And one of the things we're trying to do is understand what is the cost-benefit analysis when it comes to things like reskilling, when it comes to things like human capital investment for businesses. And by and large, and we haven't completed the research, but we'll put this out at Davos, by and large, we found that it is almost always going to be better for companies to build rather than to buy human capital. And so they need to be thinking very differently when it comes about the short-termism in terms of displacement. It's going to be much better for them to actually hang on to that talent, to redeploy those people towards new jobs, even if it means taking on some of that cost for the short term, because it is almost always going to be cheaper than trying to buy wholly new talent, especially if every business is acting in that way, because very soon there won't be that talent and that in the workplace learning going on.
Thanks, Saadia. A lady at the back wants to ask a question. I'd love to get that in if we've got time. Can we get the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Claudia Olsen from Sweden, an entrepreneur in education, also associate faculty with Singularity University. And I'm very curious to hear about how do we train the skills for the future? What best practices are there? And how do we adjust our educational systems to both be able to adjust fast enough for the skills we need in the coming years, but also in the long term?
I'll say something quickly because I think this is probably more your area. One of the things that I think is not emphasized enough in terms of education is critical thinking skills and inequality in education. And I find in the UK, where I currently live, that the inequality in the educational system, literally in terms of private, public, is one of the key drivers of inequality. But also what's interesting is that if you're in a private school, you're actually taught philosophy. You're taught Greek and Latin. If you're in a public school, you often are not. And the question is, what is it about philosophy, questioning, reading the kind of, big questions in the past in terms of ethics and morality that actually prepares you for the kind of questions we're talking about? And even though we obsess about coding and those kinds of skills, that critical thinking skill is just as important. And interestingly, it's the first thing that goes when we start sort of, dismantling a properly structured state education system.
I agree that we need to teach critical thinking skills. Here's the problem. We have no idea how to do that. For example, there's absolutely no evidence that giving people an ethics or a philosophy curriculum helps them think more ethically or more deeply about philosophical questions. It's kind of a thing that we do because we feel good about the humanities. You are from Sweden. I would encourage you to take a short trip and go look at your neighbors in Finland. They have a fascinating educational system. They start school later in life than most other countries. They are much less regimented than most other Western countries, let alone Eastern ones. And their students do extraordinarily well on these international standardized tests. Something is going on in that country. I think it's pretty close to the good fortune that I had for the earliest years of my schooling. I was a Montessori kid for the first years of school. And what that taught me was that the world is an interesting place, and my job is to go poke at it. And I'm incredibly grateful to my parents that they did that for me. When I had to enter kind of the normal American public educational system, I thought that someone was playing a prank on me because I was sitting in this orderly grid of desks and a new subject was being inflicted on me every hour. That's pretty good preparation for an assembly line worker or a payroll clerk. We just don't need those kinds of workers anymore. So by all means, let little kids go poke at the world and work with each other. I hope that translates pretty well into the skills we need for the second machine age.
Thank you. Well, we're perilously short of time. In fact, we're over time, which for a Swiss organisation is heinous crime. Quick show of hands. Who's optimistic that we will create more jobs than we will displace in the next 5 years? Well, there's a bit of work to be done today and tomorrow to put that right. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for watching online, and thank you for taking time out of joining us here in the room as well. The session's over.